I will make the introduction in Catalan, but I know you have it. You have it. All right. Bona tarda a tothom, moltes gràcies per ser aquí. Avui fem la lliçó inaugural de la Fundació Irla, a principi del curs, com sabeu cada any. El que volem és donar veu a la reflexió, al pensament, a les idees, en un món no només accelerat, sinó absolutament superficial moltes vegades. És bo aturar-nos i pensar i escoltar. I avui tenim un privilegi que és tenir una de les persones que més ens ha ajudat a pensar, a construir discurs, a construir pensament, i que a més ho fa en un context en el que aquesta feina és més necessària que mai, que és en Calhoun. És una persona, i no és una exageració, globalment coneguda, i això avui en dia és important, és necessari que en un marc en què el discurs es globalitza també puguem globalitzar el que és la reflexió del pensament crític, i en aquest sentit escoltar gent que està vivint des de la proximitat del focus que avui suposa el nou escenari, el nou paradigma que s'obre als Estats Units, doncs una persona que ens portarà aquesta reflexió en dos conceptes que són fonamentals, com és, per una banda, el tema nacional, la nació, el concepte de nació, què vol dir nació avui en un món globalitzat, i per una altra banda el que és la construcció social des de la perspectiva de la construcció de comunitat, des de la construcció de base, des de la militància, en el sentit més estricte del terme. En Calhoun és una persona coneguda per moltes coses, no només per allò que escriu, sinó també per allò que ensenya, és professor a diverses universitats, en aquest cas està a Princeton i està a Arizona, ha sigut professor de la New York University, del London School of Economics, i per tant tenim una oportunitat, dir-ne històrica és, diguem-ho, potser una mica exagerat, però crec que és especialment important que puguem tenir la possibilitat d'escoltar algú de primera mà. En un món en què tot és a través de pantalles i a través, diguem, de xarxes virtuals, poder tenir-la, aquesta persona, físicament amb nosaltres és un honor i és un privilegi. Per què ho fem des de la Fundació Irla? Per què des de la Fundació Irla pensem en una persona com en Craig per fer aquesta lliçó inaugural, i per què pensem que aquests temes que ell treballa, que ell ha treballat, dels quals ell ha exposat, ens serveixen per reforçar el nostre ideari republicà d'esquerres social i nacional? Doncs bàsicament perquè la nostra és una lluita global. La nostra és una lluita i és una reivindicació col·lectiva, però també és una lluita i és una reivindicació global. I des de la Fundació Irla, que volem dotar de contingut i de pensament justament aquestes reivindicacions, siguin a Catalunya o siguin als Estats Units, entenem que podem fer aquests vincles. Jo tinc un paper absolutament instrumental, que és el de donar-vos la benvinguda en nom de la Fundació Irla i, en tot cas, presentar a qui formalment farà la presentació d'en Craig, que és la Eunice Romero, sociòloga, politòloga, companya de lluites i de reivindicacions en molts espais i en molts temes, experta en migracions i experta en qüestió nacional. De fet, són els dos temes que l'han posat, per dir-ho així, més en rellevància i més en el que és el debat públic, a més d'una perspectiva, des d'una mirada molt singular, que és la que ella ens ha portat, i que, a més, entre moltes altres coses, és també doctorant d'en Calhoun. Per tant, des d'aquesta perspectiva, és una persona que el coneix molt en la vessant acadèmica i, òbviament, també en la vessant personal, i la possibilitat que ella faci la glosa inicial de la presentació del ponent ens ha semblat que era una doble oportunitat, en aquest cas també històrica, per poder-ho fer. Jo ho deixo aquí, donant-vos la benvinguda, moltíssimes gràcies. Farem la intervenció de presentació, òbviament, primer, i després la intervenció d'en Craig, i després obrirem un torn de preguntes, que en aquest cas intentarem moderar perquè sigui el més dinàmiques possible. Per tant, res més, moltíssimes gràcies, i ja sé que han passat uns dies, però bon any a tothom i que tingueu una bona jornada.
Molt bé. Fem per aquí, més directament. Bona tarda. És un goig per mi ser avui aquí. De fet, m'havia preparat algunes notes per no estendre'm gaire més del que toca. És un plaer perquè portem avui un amic, ara ja després de 15 anys de treball compartit, de poder pensar, de fet, el cas català, que és el que m'ha portat a viure entre vosaltres. Sabeu que jo soc mexicana, molts dels que em coneixeu, i precisament per pensar-lo d'una manera molt singular, gràcies a l'obra d'en Craig. És una persona que presentaré, per tant, en tant que el que ha aportat a l'àmbit, òbviament, del nacionalisme. Moltes de les persones que sou aquí el coneixeu per aquesta vessant, però crec que és molt important que reconeguem també la seva globalitat en molts sentits. Aquesta és la paraula segurament que el defineix millor. Estem parlant d'un intel·lectual de primera magnitud. Pràcticament qualsevol persona investigadora que sigui seriosa i estigui interessat per qualsevol dels grans temes de la nostra era, tant en l'àmbit de les ciències socials, ciència política, sociologia, història, economia, antropologia, com en el de les humanitats, les religions, drets humans, filosofia, trobarà a la seva obra claus per a l'anàlisi del seu objecte d'estudi. Algunes de les temàtiques que s'han beneficiat d'aquestes reflexions i anàlisis són, doncs estem parlant des de les protestes, les lluites de classe obrera, la història, importantment, la història econòmica a nivell macro i a nivell micro, i aquesta també defugint, diguéssim, sempre, sobretot, de les idees simples i connectant tots els coneixements de diverses disciplines. Crec que Calhoun és a més singular com a acadèmic del nord global, estatunidenc de passaport i naixement, format en les institucions acadèmiques i de pensaments més centrals en la producció de coneixement al món, ha dedicat la seva tasca a temes que interpel·len realitats socials en una multiplicitat de contextos geogràfics. I ho ha fet sempre tenint una clara vocació per defugir de la parcialitat que sol empobrir bona part de la tasca acadèmica de qui es considera a si mateix universal. Això ho demostra el fet que hagi impartit classe en 4 continents: Àfrica, Amèrica, Europa i Àsia. I sigui ponent recurrent a l'altre. La petjada intel·lectual de Calhoun li va fer mereixedor del doctorat honoris causa a la Trobe University, a Austràlia, on és col·laborador clau per a l'impuls de Thesis 11. Alguns de vosaltres que us agradi el pensament polític segurament sabreu a quina publicació em refereixo. També ha rebut el doctorat honoris causa a l'Erasmus University a Rotterdam i diguéssim que de Beijing a Londres, passant per Oslo, Asmara, Khartoum, Manchester i Nova York, entre d'altres capitals mundials, han alimentat la imaginació sociològica de Craig. El gran abast geogràfic del seu recorregut només té parangon amb la seva aproximació multidisciplinar a la realitat social. Craig se sent a casa a la sociologia, però a manco més de la solidesa intel·lectual s'ha immergit en altres disciplines necessàries per a la millora i aprofundiment de la comprensió dels fenòmens socials i polítics que ens apressen actualment. Des del seu pas pels estudis de cinema, matèria on va formar-se a les seves primeres passes per la universitat, tot navegant per l'antropologia, la història social i econòmica de la modernitat, fins a l'urbanisme o la filosofia, Calhoun pensa connectant diverses dimensions i escales d'interacció. La sociologia de Craig Calhoun és un desafiament a la simplicitat maniquea del blanc o negre, bo o dolent, el paisatge sociològic que dibuixa quan pensa sobre les religions, l'esfera pública, els moviments socials, les desigualtats extremes, la democràcia, el populisme i, evidentment, sobre la nació, és matisat, ple de textures, relleus i paradoxes. És allà on ens porta de la mà de la teoria crítica social a la intervenció real estratègica en les polítiques públiques, les organitzacions sense ànim de lucre i d'altres actors importants en l'acció social. Els que hem après a pensar a través de la seva obra ens beneficiem d'una lectura a vol d'ocell i un passeig percebent el gra de la sorra fina sota els nostres peus. L'etnografia sociològica que s'ha anat escrivint per l'Escola de Pensament de què li és d'autora no és mai absent de reflexions filosòfiques de la més alta abstracció. La filosofia de les religions, que veu de la seva mirada, es preocupa de l'arrelament històric de les praxis de les feligreses. Tot i alhora. La seva generositat fa que aquesta globalitat del seu recorregut vital i intel·lectual no l'hagi reservada per un exercici academicista a la Torre d'Ivori, ni tan sols per a la seva carrera individual. Calhoun és una persona d'equip, que crea, que ni tan sols que fa possible que connecta i fa possible la transformació social, il·luminant amb pensament rigorós els temes que semblen inèdits, però que vistos en perspectiva històrica sempre ofereixen algun patró útil per a l'anàlisi i la intervenció pràctica, l'acció política. Aquest tarannà l'ha portat a tenir una carrera més enllà de l'acadèmia. En l'àmbit de les institucions, aquestes que són les que fan possibles condicions materials per crear el coneixement, Crec que ha dirigit diversos equips pioners, fundant tant centres de recerca dins de les universitats on ha exercit com a professor de sociologia, deixant rere seu un panorama alentador i llavors per a generacions venidores. I podem destacar en aquest àmbit la seva tasca com a director per més d'una dècada, de 1999 al 2012, del Social Science Research Council als Estats Units, que és la institució que engloba i emmarca totes les ciències socials de les grans universitats que sabeu que són cabdals als Estats Units, però evidentment tenen un impacte al món. I en el seu mandat, les ciències socials de tot el país van transformar la mirada per poder complir amb la tasca pública, connectant teoria amb praxis, amb la major qualitat i compromís possibles. De 2012 a 2016 va ser president i director de la London School of Economics and Political Science, on també va deixar petjada, moldejant la vida estudiantil des dels edificis públics, des dels edificis i la vida, diguéssim, d'interacció, fins a les mirades amb un clar compromís per allò públic. Actualment, al costat de la Pam Delargy, la seva companya, que ens acompanya avui, ha tornat a les aules, fent de Global Professor tant a l'Arizona State University com a Princeton, i continua impartint lliçons magistrals de tant en tant, tant a Columbia com a la London School of Economics, on continua fent de Centennial Professor. I moltes de les organitzacions interessades per l'esdevenidor de les universitats al món compten amb ell com una de les veus referents. Ha estat també un assessor important en el seu rol com a president de la London School of Economics de David Cameron en el seu moment, converses dels grans líders polítics i socials, i precisament aquest tarannà que té d'obertura i de compromís amb la realitat més directa és el que fa que permei tant la manera que té de pensar les coses i sobretot diríem que en definitiva aquestes alçades i en aquests moments tan convulsos al món crec que és un bri d'esperança. És aquesta persona que en actiu encara ens permet pensar d'una manera desafiant les idees planes, les idees de contradicció, per entendre-les com una paradoxa complexa en la qual podem viure i aspirar a estar en solidaritat i en una societat més inclusiva. Moltes gràcies.
So it is a pleasure to be here. It was a pleasure to be here already even before that very beautiful introduction. Every professor hopes that someday one or more of his students might think such nice things about him. I'm honored to be here at the invitation of the Fundació Irla. It is a terrific opportunity to speak with you, but also terrific to engage with such a foundation and the heritage it represents in Catalonia. I'm also very happy to be at the social hub created by the Fundació Bofill. I think that this is a very important kind of institution, and it's not unrelated to my question. So I will say one thing about that in advance of actually the presentation, which is that sometimes when people talk about the nation and nationalism, they say, oh, it's a political topic, and only a political topic. It's about independence or autonomy or respect. But they forget it's also a topic about building a society, that the nation is a people who have relations with each other and have a past and a future and ways of organizing life together. And so a social hub is integral to an idea, which in a way Barcelona has always represented to me very well, an idea that different people from different backgrounds and occupations and politics and different roles in life can come together and interact to be making the social world and making a nation and changing it. So nation is not just something we inherit from grandparents. It is also something we actively engage in creating, and I've enjoyed that. And I will tell you one more little story before I begin, which is my introduction to Barcelona and in some part to nationalism, which I hadn't thought about very much before, and nationality. And it's just that I was a student at Oxford University in England and had a variety of friends, Catalan and Castellano, right, friends. And I learned in that context that some of them thought it was great when you said Spanish, and some of them thought it was not great when you said Spanish. But everybody was excited after the death of Franco. And after the death of Franco, all of these students, the Castellanos and the Catalans, went back, and they came here, and I came along with my friends. And so the first time I visited Barcelona was shortly after the death of Franco. I was at the first performance of the Orfeo Catalana, which was able to sing the national anthem after the death of Franco, and other similar events. So that was very exciting. I was actually at the famous football match between Barca and Madrid, which took place, and the first one after that, which was an incredibly emotional experience. And I mean, not only a successful game, a victory, 1-0, but in fact, lots of hugging and enthusiasm, and I couldn't understand the Catalan, but I could understand the hugging. And so there was something very moving about this. The friend who invited me here and was my host was named João. I won't tell you his last name or rest of his names because of the rest of this story, which is just... So João was great. He was an economist. He was a terrific student in Oxford. He was a good friend here. And I sort of lost touch with him occasionally for 2 or 3 years, but then lost touch. And the next time I was back in Barcelona, 10 years later, he was Juan. How did João become Juan? And I asked a friend, why? Before he was always Juan. Why is he Juan? They said, well, he got that job at the bank. And then they made him vice president of the bank, and he was Juan. And it's a lesson in nationalism, not just about João or about Juan, right? Or about the specifics of Catalonia, right? It's a lesson about the many different dimensions of belonging and identity and self-representation and understanding. He was also an activist in the PSUC, and so he moved from Communist Party with the bank. He moved first to PSOE, but then he moved a bit further, I gather, and was more recently in Ciudadanos. And so there are life course trajectories in which people reshape who they are in relationship to national identity. Other friends stayed the same or moved in the other direction, right? As possibilities for autonomy and independence became clearer, they became more enthusiastically national in their self-understandings. So context matters, history matters, these changes matter, and the result, now I start the actual talk, is that no one clear, simple idea can own nationalism or can own what it means to be in a nation. There is no one sentence, no one short definition in the dictionary that does justice to this kind of topic, which shifts in a variety of ways. Whoops, what is happening here? Am I not starting at the beginning? Even though nationalism is an extremely complicated topic, it's best to start at the beginning. Not the beginning of all nationalism in history. I'm not going to have an extended discussion of the days of the Roman Empire or something like that, but the beginning of the talk, in which I want to stress both phrases. When I was asked about a title very early, we agreed on the persistence of nationalism in an era of globalization, but I think you will agree today that it's a question of resurgence, not just persistence, that they're both real parts of the story of nationalism around us. And last year, right, there were more than 60 democratic elections at the national scale, that is of centralized governments, right? And the incumbents were defeated in the vast majority of these, and almost all of them were significantly about nation, about questions of nationalism, about collective identity, about the worry of being dominated by another country, the worry of being dominated by the global capitalist US-led financial system, about the worry of traditions being undermined that people cared about in these different countries. So nation is very much the forefront of our understanding today. We really can't think of it, moreover, just as something that's persisted. It's something that is particularly important now, today. So why? Right? Part of the reason is people are afraid. right? They have a variety of things that worry them about their lives and about the world, and nation is part of what they hope will protect them, will give them security, will give them identity in that context. Right? Part of it is because we are hopeful. We want a better world. We don't want just the things that worry us. And it is as members of a nation, it is with the other people in our nation that we expect to be able to build a better future. Right? So it's wrong to ignore the worries, and it's wrong to ignore the hope. You have to feel both together in some sense. And I think that the official, professional, academic literature has often been about taking sides on these questions. It's really all about anxiety. It's really all about hope. No, it's really all about both, right? We have plenty to be afraid of. I won't repeat every word, right? But of war, of imperialism, of migration, of cultural loss. Different ones of us are more afraid about one thing or another, right? For some people, it is losing the language that they grew up in and that they read in and that their favorite authors wrote in and that is basic to their identity. Right? In some other settings, language is not the most important question of nationalism, but there is a huge worry, nonetheless, about immigration, right? Or a huge worry about war. Right? There are plenty of different dimensions to be worried about. But I stress again the hopeful point. Every one of these. War makes people hope for peace, right? There's another side to every story, but also the way in which nation becomes a part of it. Now, nation is not the only way in which we experience being part of a community. It's, however, a very important way in which we learn how to say we at a relatively large scale. We can say we about our family, we about a neighborhood, we about a community, right? But in our large and complex world, the nation matters enormously when we try to say we in a way that connects to the large-scale affairs that affect our lives. Now, hidden in that, of course, is there are large and small nations. They're not all the same. And the story of nation and nationalism will be different for a relatively small nation. You know, for a small nation like San Marino, compared to a big nation like Catalonia or China, right? It's going to be a somewhat different story. And that's one of the things that we have to remember, because there's a lot that tries to convince us that nations are all equivalent, that they're all the same, seat in the United Nations, right? Or official sovereignty in some sense. But it's always more complicated. Now, you may have seen a picture of this man. He's been in the news a lot lately, right? He is a significant figure where I come from and around the world, and for thinking about nationalism. Right? Donald Trump is not the only nationalist who is a right-wing populist, but he's a prominent one. Right? And we can debate all of these words. What does right-wing mean? What does populist mean? What does nationalist mean? I don't know that debating the words is the crucial thing. You probably get the idea in a fairly general way. Right? But, right, in this moment where we've just inaugurated Donald Trump, right, he has declared a variety of policies already in his first 2 days, right, many of which are overwhelmingly about questions of national identity, national borders, national strength, national solidarity, right? And I'm not here to endorse or condemn Donald Trump specifically, or take any other position, a partisan position, but to try to suggest that we see the position takings, we see the positions, his or others, here and elsewhere, in an analytic way that helps us ask what's specific about them, including what does it mean to say this right-wing populist is also a nationalist? What does nationalism and national question add to it? Right? You can say things like, well, of course, the immigration question. Yes, that has a very basic relationship to it. But not only that, right? The question of militarization. We should be strong, and we should be able to stand strong in the world. The choice. How do we deal with migration or with the rise of China or other questions? Do we deal with them by trying to be really strong? Or do we deal with them by trying to build a different world order through international organizations, which would promote greater peace, equality, security? But there are different ways of doing that. And that introduces one of the hardest things I've always found in talking about nationalism. When you say the word nationalism, many people think you are talking about militarism or about right-wing populism, even fascism, right? They don't think you might be talking about how do you become the kind of nation that becomes part of the EU or part of the United Nations or constructively part of global society in general, defending human rights, making your nation better because it respects human rights. So when you talk about nationalism, there's a tendency for people to hear, right, the negative side, the worrying side, and to miss the positive or important sides of national work, to hear the response to anxiety and not the hope, right? And some national leaders, including this one, play a lot on trying to make sure people are even more afraid than they were already. They win elections not by reassuring people, not by saying, I'm going to build social solidarity, but by saying, yes, you really should be worried about those Chinese, but I'm going to make us strong to deal with the Chinese. Yes, you really should be worried about those migrants, but I'm going to send the army to the border and build a wall. Right? So there are different ways of approaching each of these. And one of the most important things to realize about Donald Trump is that he may be unique, but he's not alone. Right? There are many versions of right-wing populist nationalism around the world. One of the illusions is that each one is just a story of that country. Oh, Donald Trump, he's specifically American. There's a lot that is specifically American about him, although he's a child of German and Scottish people, right? I mean, he's very American story, right? There's a lot that is specifically Israeli or specifically German or specifically Hungarian. But there is also something, I think, readily in common, readily seen as in common to these different right-wing populist nationalist leaders. They share something together. We get why they're a group. We see this. But an issue, right, well, we should recognize and analyze that, I should say, is that we misunderstand each one if we don't see the rest. If we don't understand that this is part of the globalization story. Globalization is not the non-national story to which the national people respond. Globalization includes the production of nationalisms of different kinds, including right-wing populist ones, all over the world, and the production of the issues that give rise to them. So we're all already in this and connected to each other. But second key point, along with seeing those connections, is to recognize that that's not the whole story of nationalism, right? That nationalism is not owned by right-wing populism or by any other one kind of it, as I said already, right? That people can be very committed to their nations and come up with different political and social and cultural responses to that commitment. They can do different things with it, right? And in fact, right, democracy, as we've built it at relatively large scale, depends a lot on nationalism. Strangely enough, because people say, are you a nationalist? Are you for democracy? No, they depend on each other, right? If you could say we at a large scale in another way, then you could say we the people, and you could figure out who votes and how we are in it together and have democracy. But in fact, right, our local ways of having democracy, we the family, we the neighborhood, we the people getting things done, are related to larger scale, right? So although it is the impression of this foreigner and many other foreigners who visit Barcelona that everybody knows each other, everybody in Barcelona knows everybody else in Barcelona, I actually am pretty sure that's not true. It's more true for elites than it is for non-elites, right? But even there, right, there are different neighborhoods, there are different groups, there are different occupations, right? A lot of people are strangers to each other. And we build democracies where we are able to share a commitment to a country and a way of life with people who are not our close personal friends and family. if we had to depend on being close personal friends and family to be able to have a democracy, then we couldn't have one of much more than 100 people, right? So we need ways of relating to people who are not, in that sense, our close friends. They're strangers, right? But they're familiar. So language comes in, right? Or values or various specific ways of life, right? And we could go into what are the characteristic ways of life. You're better positioned to describe a Catalan way of life. How would you know a fellow Catalan? And I'm going to guess you feel you sort of would if you ran into them. They were strangers, right? But you ran into them in the airport in Paris. You might have a chance of connecting, right? Your fellow nationality. And it might be because you just overheard them speaking the language. But that's not the only way, right? And we could go on with how this works. But my point is, not that there's one formula, but that if there isn't some way of understanding what it means to be in it together at a larger scale, you can't have democracy. You find it very hard to have social welfare programs that reduce inequalities, that depend on taxation, because the commitment to the common good is what makes people willing to pay their taxes to support the common good, whether you define it in the better roads or the better healthcare system or the more honorable way of dealing with questions of human rights. It depends, right, on that commitment. And so that commitment is significant. Now, I'm not going to give a talk about Catalan nationalism because every one of you knows more about it than I do, and I'm not the specialist, and even if I were, it would be the wrong thing to do as a visitor. But I want to mention a couple of things here. First, right, one part of the Catalan story is not being Spain, right? That is, one part of the Catalan story is a resistance to usage, as I said of my Oxford friends, of Spanish as an inclusive term that doesn't make a place for a separate identity. And that has a politics about the expansion of the Spanish state and what's going on, but it has a kind of cultural resonance, right? But it's only one dimension. Catalonia doesn't exist just to be not Spain, right? It doesn't exist, it isn't defined simply by a negative, what we're not. So it may be that certain Castilian policies and wars at certain times have played a very big role in Catalan national consciousness and history. Right? There's a reason that Josep Irla was the president in exile and not here. Right? So Castilian factors may shape Catalan identity, but Catalan identity is not only about not being Castilian. There are a lot of ways to not be Castilian. You know, the Basque are not Castilian, the Catalans are not Basque. So what is it for? Right? And so there's a question of the positive identity. The 38% is not Catalonia. You know the reference to the particular vote and the election, but which immediately raises the question, who speaks for the country? Whose voices have more influence than others' voices? The country doesn't have a way of just speaking all at once for everybody. You can have a huge demonstration and fill a plaza, but there are still different people shouting, and that's not the whole population because there are a lot of people off in other places who didn't come into the city to be in the demonstration. And the relationship between the countryside and the city is not one of perfect identity, in which everybody feels being Catalan exactly the same way wherever they are. And there are international connections and influences. This is not Catalan, though it involves a shared tune to two different national anthems, right? The French influence, the impact of the French Revolution on thinking about national identity and self-government and autonomy and the people as the sovereign, the idea that if you say about Catalan, under the influence of French and other ideas, that it's not about a class, it is about popular sovereignty, but the popular people are Catalan, and that's got to be worked out. So what is nationalism then when we say it persists in the global age? Mostly, my slide is telling you not to think there's an easy answer, right? It's what a philosopher once called an essentially contested question. That doesn't mean that people just argue about it a lot. it means that there's no way to resolve the argument that doesn't do violence to one position or another. And so if you think about how do you settle what nationalism is in a way that doesn't hurt somebody's views of what it means to them, it's very hard. There's no single common denominator that clearly demarcates and doesn't bring in others. So every resolution to the question, what is nationalism, introduces a kind of prejudice against somebody's values, about somebody and what they care about in their country and their nation. You have to accept some ambiguity, and in relation to the academic literature about nationalism, you have to recognize that there are some false binary choices. Right? These ideas of ethnic versus civic nationalism, or cultural versus political, imply that there's a world in which some people are all cultural and other people are all political. They were forged in large part in comparing Germany and France and trying to see what was different in those two cases in the 20th century. They dominated a lot of European history in the early 20th century, right? But it's a misleading idea. So the idea of ethnic nationalism is that to be a part of a nation, we share customs. We share maybe even descent historically, though it's really hard to work that out in a perfect way, right? How far back do you go? Which cavemen were there? I was once, I remember very strongly a particular museum in Sweden which had a display of prehistoric archaeological finds, and it kept reporting this is Swedish and this is Norwegian and things like that. There was no Sweden and Norway, that was not true then. Sweden and Norway get invented over time, and then the archaeological finds happen in one place or another. And you can say there's a different relationship of many of the places where the Roman Empire extended from those it didn't, but then they weren't necessarily exactly what they are now. But anyway, the point is, you can, however, even if descent doesn't work exactly, we had common ancestors, having common language, having common food, having a variety of ways in which we feel a part of an ethnic group is a meaningful version of what we feel together. And it probably is a mistake, in my opinion, to think that that all has biological grounds, right? That is, the racist versions of it are not merely problematic, which I think they are, but they're probably wrong, right? It's not the whole story. But things like the food and the culture, the taste, are not unreasonable. The common history matters, so something ethnic is there. It is really true that there are different, right, habitual tastes. On the other hand, the civic idea means that you value democracy and inclusion and political institutions are basic. So I would say, and I will hazard saying something very specific about Catalonia and the rest of the country, which is, if it were only a question of ethnicity, Catalonia wouldn't exist. Not because there's not something shared in ethnic terms, but because the struggle that has helped to shape Catalonia has been a struggle for common institutions, right? The struggle that shaped the Spanish Civil War was not just an ethnic struggle in some way, it was a struggle over what kind of institutions are we going to have, right? And so figures like Josep Irla, right, are part of a struggle over what kind of institutions unite us as Catalans. What does the government mean for us, right? And so they're mixed together. And my point about this is you can't just put all the good on one side and all the bad on the other side and say that, but you have to see mixture. And therefore you have to take on board the challenge. In my country, where nationalism means different things to different people, I stand for trying to have it mean the better things when we face choices together, okay? But it means in most countries you can find some rather disreputable fascist figure who was a nationalist, and that doesn't discredit the whole country, but it points to a reality to be dealt with. So it's always both and, some of each, right? And there are even more dimensions and variables, ways in which nations differ from each other. We say nations and nationalism persist, right? Are we talking about commitment to a durable cultural tradition? Yes, in most cases, very definitely yes in the Catalan case, though with recognition that the cultural tradition has more than once undergone a kind of renewal, right? That there are periods of important cultural creativity, periods in which continuity was challenged, periods in which there's a renewal, even for the language, right? To bring it back and make it live again. And it's always a question for language. It's a question today. How well are Catalans or anyone else going to do with making their common language live as a part of people's lives, rather than being only symbolically learned as a part of their political loyalty or civics education? Right? It's a question. The view that the nation should be congruent with the state. In other words, that there should be a match. We use commonly, in English at least, the word nation-state, the term, with a hyphen connecting them. Nation, that little line, hyphen, state. A lot of work is done by that hyphen, because the idea is that the two should match each other. There should be a perfect match between the nation and state, but it's an idea. It's a project. It's hardly ever the exact reality, right? There's usually complexity. So you don't go to Swiss people and say, there's no Swiss nation. You guys don't exist. You say, okay, it's a multinational nation. That's a complicated thing. You speak different languages. You have different cultures, but you also have common institutions. I recognize that, right? There are different ways of working this out. Some level of integration cohesion is important. Perfect uniformity never happens, and it doesn't sound totally attractive if it does happen. We aren't really about being all the same, right? Having borders, yes, perhaps. What do the borders do? How do we run this? How does it imagine? So we have that notion. We have an identification of self with nation, another dimension. Can you be who you are if your nation doesn't exist, if you can't be a part of it? Maybe it's a very important part of who you are, right? Maybe even you don't think about it very much until something happens, and then you think that. Or you're like me and you grow up in the United States, which for a long time thought it was the whole world, and not until you go to another country do you realize, not everybody's an American, right? That things are different in different places, right? And yet, I have to admit that I am an American. Right? When I went to study in England, there was a whole kind of American student who tried to adopt British accents, right, and pass as British while they were there studying. And it always seems sort of like you should just admit you're an American and deal with it, but it is complicated, right? That identification of self with nation is very important. Why are people willing to join the army and die in wars or kill in wars? Dying and killing are both hard things to do for most people, right? And yet, people will identify in these really strong ways. But people also, right, sometimes prioritize other loyalties or identities. They prioritize their party, or they prioritize their community over the national whole, right? And elevating one's own nation above others. This is one of the most common things people mean when they say nationalism. Right? I mean, mine is really great and yours is only okay. Right? That's the sort of Euro song contest version of it. Right? But they also mean things like mine should dominate and yours should be subordinate. Right? And a lot of the intuitive things that people hear when they hear nationalism are that, right, about domination. And I already said the ability to say we at large scale. There are a variety of ways in which nationalism persists in an age of globalization, right? And they include what's called famously by the sociologists would expect, methodological nationalism, but it's not just method, it's a kind of way in which we represent the world, right? So that we represent the world in statistics, and it's hard to see what's going on in the world without reproducing the notion of nation. Maybe without noticing, hey, they always have Spain and they don't have Catalonia listed. Why is that, right? Because the World Bank or other organizations are reproducing a certain kind of national consciousness which fits with some lists of nations, right? Or again, maps, right? And the territories on the maps have borders around them. Wait, wasn't there supposed to be something here, right? So they have a common color, right? In this case, Spain is all that sort of darker yellow. Poland is all that sort of lighter yellow, right? But that creates an image of uniformity and boundedness that is at odds with the complexity of reality. But it reproduces the tacit notion of nation, so that even if you say, actually, there should be Catalonia here, you may then accidentally accept that, of course, France is just France, right? And that there aren't similar, the Occitane don't have any sort of argument, that there's not some sort of question there, right? There are what have been called the banal symbols of nationalism that reproduce it, right? The flags, the parades, the postage stamps that do this. I think this is the earlier version of my talk, and which after I had produced this version, I thought, let's think about Catalan postage history. I'd never thought about Catalan postage history. So I don't have the pictures to support it, but of course there is a Catalan postage history. There were Carlist Catalan stamps in the 19th century, right? There were various contending efforts during the era of the Civil War to produce Catalan stamps, which were sometimes stamps of a claimed Catalonia, were sometimes stamps of a particular party and its vision of a Catalonia, and sometimes stamps of a particular voluntary organization and the way it worked, which gives us a clue to how nations work, that all those things are real. But it just suggests to us the power of these symbols, and then the power that they can have sometimes creatively and helpfully, but often oppressively. And in the background to this is the fact that nations do not exist naturally. Right? The world didn't come that way. They had to be historically created. All those borders had to be put in place. There are a lot of them. They are not naturally green and brown and yellow and in different colors. They are not naturally those shapes. Those have been settled. There are reasons why, for example, in some parts of the world, there are no straight lines around national borders, and in other parts of the world, they're all straight lines. The short answer is that if the nation grew more or less organically, there might not be straight lines, but if some European colonial powers decided your borders, there are probably straight lines. Okay? And all of this is put in place over a long history, which doesn't mean that people don't feel intensely like it is the only way they could live their lives, right? And as though it were natural, right? There are lots of conflicts over this. Right? I'm not going to try to tell the story of the Syrian conflict or the Gaza-Palestine conflict or any other conflict, just to say, in our time, we are remaking nations and national borders. And the we of that statement, we are remaking, is a complicated we. Who's doing the remaking? Who is fighting in the battles, winning or losing? Who is approving this in various kinds of international settings? And who is kind of not reading that far in the newspaper because it's just a little bit discouraging, or they don't really know where it is or what's going on, right? So some of you probably have a significant level of knowledge of the conflict in Myanmar, and some of you probably have none. And I'm not going to ask. I'm merely making the point that there are big and significant conflicts, and some that we know about, like the conflict in Sudan, which gets in the newspapers repeatedly, we also repeatedly forget about and do almost nothing about, even though more people have died in that conflict than in some of the other tragic conflicts. Okay? So nation is an open question in all of this. Migrations are reshaping the world as well. And migrations are actually as real as nations. So one of the effects of those maps with the hard borders and the clear colors is to make you think that the nation is real, the nation state, right? And the migration is something that comes from somewhere else and happens to the nation state. But the migrations are real. They go on for very long periods of time in history. They have patterns. Many people live their whole lives in a migration, right? They don't just get on an airplane and go from one place to another. They are part of a flow of people, which is connecting different parts of the world, which is reshaping cultures, right? And which is remaking who we are, right? So it would be a different lecture, and I won't go into it, but if we're going to say, okay, for any European country, including Catalonia, what's the migration that made this country possible? Over thousands of years, but also over a more recent period in time. How did that work? What level of geography, of pressure from economic issues, of pressure from political issues, of refugees from wars, of interventions by foreign countries that drove people out? What is the pattern that shaped it, and how did people live that? If we could go back in time to the days of the Civil War, right, it was not my actual preference, you would see the war, of course, we'd learn about that. You would see the struggle for Catalonia, and you would see some solidarity, you would see the different politics of it, and you would see flows of refugees, right, that are as inextricably a part of that story. So refugees, but also economic migrants, because there are also pressures to migrate, coming from jobs, coming from demography, all of this. And there are people, right, working to try to deal with that. And they may be dealing with it in humanitarian ways, but they may also not be. They may also precisely be not choosing the common humanity, but choosing the wall, or choosing not to save the people in the Mediterranean, right? So there are these stories that are also parts of the long-term realities. And there are all kinds of other crises. So when we say people, when I say at the beginning, that there are a lot of things that are really worrying in the world, and that nation is part of how we try to figure out how to have some security in the face of worry. Yeah, climate change, right? Now, think about it, though. There's no national solution to climate change. You have a better recycling program and refuse and collection program and so forth than almost any other city in the world. It will not, I'm afraid, solve the problem of climate change by itself, right? There is no local way to solve a global problem, but there are local ways to be part of the solution or to make it worse, right? And this matters. International security and terrorism, the map where it says Norse at the top is a map of cyber terrorist efforts, right? Attacks on the internet in a single day, right? The drug wars, right? We've got a lot of different things that are justifiably worrying and remind us that these standard maps convey a false sense of security. The world looks much more stable and settled in those maps than it really is if you begin to take account of what's going on. So, right, what's going on today, right? Well, the United States is considering taking over Greenland, in case you haven't heard, right? Now, this is actually an old idea. It's been considered off and on for 150 years, right? How should we think about that? What's up with the United States? What's up with our new president on his first day in office and during the campaign saying he was thinking of taking over Greenland? By the way, Canada should be a state, but we should build a wall between us and Mexico, right? Didn't offer to make them a state, right? And so what is going on? Well, what's going on is partly a way of thinking that is different from the kind of international order that existed for decades after World War II, in which various countries in the world, understanding themselves as nation states, gathered in the United Nations and in other settings and said, we're going to work out rules for dealing with our conflicts that don't involve having more wars. And we didn't do that perfectly. We've had conflicts, we've had wars in Third World and other settings, right? But it's worth pausing to reflect, right? Interstate war on the European continent has not been continuous. It stopped for a while and started again, okay? So how does this work? Well, is there a return to empire? Is the issue that basically there used to be empires. There were two Habsburg empires. Like in here, there was the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Persian Empire. There was a big negotiation among empires, Rome, China at different times. Are we just going back to that, in which the meaning of nation was a people living somewhere in relationship to an empire, okay? Not being fully autonomous and self-governing, maybe being able to run some aspects of their everyday lives, but not the big things. Is it a return to a version of nationalism in which countries felt they were being made stronger, more successful by taking over the territory of others, right? So lots of the countries on that map have the shape they have, right, because they conquered the rest. Even China, which we often think of as, oh, it's just ancient, it's always been China, was not always China. The early kingdoms of China, even the Han kingdom that most shapes the Han identity of China, were very small. They had to conquer each other around them to be able to make the bigger China and then eventually conquer Xinjiang or Tibet or other places, right? So there is a process to putting together these large spaces. It's often an unattractive process of conflict and conquest, right? And some versions of nationalism are about being strong militarily by being able to either defend yourself against the outsiders or win wars and take over. Is that what's going on with Greenland? Is it about economic wealth? Well, we're the biggest and the richest, so of course, little Denmark should sell us Greenland, right? There's some thinking that says Denmark missed its chance, that now Donald Trump is going to just take it. They should have taken the money when they had a chance to get it. But that's, not how most people, including Danes, think about their country. But also they're the question of the Greenlanders, right? So it's a Danish possession now. Is it necessary that Donald Trump should deal with Denmark about Greenland? What about the people who live in Greenland? What's their role in this? And I'm not answering the question, right? Although, frankly, I'm a Greenland nationalist. No, I'm not answering the question, right? I'm suggesting it's a question that we don't know the answer to. And that's what we have to work out in international affairs today. How do these geopolitical restructurings go? So let me give you one more point about Greenland before I move on in this, which is just, why does Donald Trump care? Donald Trump is denying climate change, saying it's really not a big issue. And the reason he cares about Greenland is that he knows it's happening. And it's opening up Arctic waterways that are going to change how things move in the world, right? And so you can go to this, you can build a railroad across Asia, but if there is global warming, you can go around by sea and rework it. So China is engaged in reunifying the whole of the Asian continent, including the small corner of Asia called Europe, right? In one big way, right? With largely inland routes, though some coastal activity, right? But there are also potential routes through the Arctic that put Greenland in the center of the story, right? Because with enough global warming, it could change the shipping, it could change the security issues for navies, right? And so it's on the table again, and it gets answered, right? Not simply in terms of global agreements. There have been calls for decades for a global agreement on the Arctic, and the countries involved could never actually make it out of the committee room with an agreement. And so it's going to get decided perhaps by either economic or military force. So it's in this context that there is a resurgence of nationalism, right? And it's hard to escape, right? And so we find ways to say essentially that we've lost faith in the internationalist order. We want to be strong, we want to defend ourselves, we want solidarity, right? We are joined together internationally in this populist right-wing version, right? And perhaps we even have a new kind of international culture of right-wing nationalism coming together with black metal music and a variety of thinkers, going back to Julius Evola or forward to Steve Bannon, Alexander Dugin, right? But it doesn't have to be that way. This kind of nationalism is on offer. It has a lot of strength, and its victory is not a foregone conclusion. It's up to us to figure out whether there are better versions of a new world order. There may be no choice except for the world to change, but we do have some choice in how it changes. Thank you. Ja.
Fantàstic. Mentre fem el canvi d'escenari, però canvi no, en tot cas fem una adaptació de l'escenari per poder passar a la següent fase. Penseu les preguntes que teniu ganes de fer. Sí que us demano, sisplau, obvi, que siguin preguntes curtes i no intervencions. Crec que tenim la possibilitat de poder respondre a diverses qüestions, però si aquestes són preguntes concretes serà més fàcil que en puguem recollir diverses. Per tant, us demano si hi ha algunes mans que vulguin aixecar i si no, veig unes quantes. La Imma, evidentment. Si us sembla, fem un set de 3 preguntes. Perfecte, passaran el micro per l'audiència. Fem un set de 3 en 3 paquets. Do you agree that we can take 3 questions and you can respond them in a row, 3 by 3?
3 by 3 is fine. Yeah, 3 by 3 is fine.
Perfecte, doncs fem les primeres. Thank you. All right. Si us sembla, fem Imma allà darrere i després... Hola.
First of all, thank you very much. It has been such an amazing pleasure to hear you. So, Mr. Calhoun, my name is Imma, and my question is, with your expertise and seeing that there seems to be some sort of global coalition of these right-wing parties and nationalism, blah, blah. Do you think it is possible to create something on the other side, on the side of the lefties, let's say it this way, that can be as strong as they are? Because it looks like we have been losing where we are and we need to find a new path. Do you think that's possible? Thank you.
Gràcies, bona tarda. Jo volia fer una pregunta al professor Calhoun en relació a la Unió Europea, que no n'ha parlat, i com veu ell la relació entre la construcció política a nivell europeu i la identitat nacional. Gràcies.
Aquí davant l'Adrià. Després farem una segona ronda.
Perfecte. Thank you very much. I missed on the equation like non-state actors, specifically corporations. I would like you to comment on them. I clearly see their interest in like right-wing national parties for the economic liberal part, but I don't understand like why are they interested in nationalism per se.
Good questions. Okay, 3 great questions, and in order that we have more, I will try to be brief in answering, although that's not something I'm good at. First, in relation to Imma's coalition, could we have a global coalition of the left? And I'm going to just accept, let's say left. We could have other ways to try to say it, but whatever. So the answer is, of course, yes, but why don't we? And we've had some level of global coalition of sort of a broadly liberal notion that papered over some contradictions that became important. So we had, from the time of the founding of the United Nations forward, a fairly substantial global agreement, and we got deeper and worked on human rights and various things. What made that not work? One, a lot of the coalition did not have deep roots in specific countries. It was a coalition among the elites of different countries, and that limited the extent. Two, right, it was changed by changing global geopolitics, as I put it up here, but let me give a specific version of it. It was changed by the transformation of capitalism. So it's not just that there was always an issue in the liberal marriage of capitalism and democracy, which we might have, from a Marxist point of view, point to, but that specifically, as capitalism became more dominated by finance globally, and by a reorganization of production and exchange that, in the case of much of Northern Europe and the US, meant a deindustrialization that created opportunities elsewhere, but took away traditional livelihoods in the rich countries, we undermined that coalition. For many people, globalization became a negative thing. They would, they respond. And then finally, in why we don't have an existing coalition, that the elites who had been a part of the previous global coalition, right, didn't pay attention. they basically ignored many of the problems that were emerging for the non-elites. Internationally, like migration, but domestically, like deindustrialization. So they didn't come up with enough solution to it. There were hints of other global coalitions, not necessarily of the left, but say the environmental climate change coalitions, which strongly unite a number of young people from different countries, but almost completely bypassing the states that they're part of. Those young people campaign to get their governments to sign treaties, but the governments aren't in the lead. It's really much more the young people. So we have a weaker coalition. But the environmental coalition gives the notion that we could have potentially stronger. And in order to build that, we would have to take seriously what I'll call solidarity, for a better word, want of a better word. That is, how we are connected to each other in ways that makes everybody's life better. And if we don't take that seriously, if we let the level of inequality, for example, become too extreme, then we really can't do this inside countries or internationally. Going down the list, I actually want to skip and go out of order and say this is one of the places where corporations come in. It's a complicated question, but it's a terrific question that people often fail to ask, right? They look at international relations like we look at this map. If you aren't on that map of green and yellow and brown territories, then you're not part of the story of international relations. But, you know, Google and Microsoft and Tencent and Huawei have international influence, right? And there are also countries that are worried because they don't have any multinational corporations in that list, and that worries them. What do they do? And then they start changing policies. Well, let's not worry about equality so much. What we need is a big competitive country in global international, right? So that part of what undermines solidarity, I think, is this role. Corporations can have, however, very different kinds of policies. They can be more benign or more problematic as multinational organizations. They can, for example, in many places, be the source of public health care when countries are not coming through with, say, antiretrovirals. And so, you know, within corporations, there is a kind of membership, a little bit like a membership, a citizenship in a country. And the corporations can be ruthless and only about short-term interests of owners, or they can take a more benign view. And we can take a position. I don't actually know the answer. Is it always in the end going to be all about making money? And that's the whole thing. Or will there be enough people in leadership who have an idea of social responsibility? But I can tell you that there are corporations that do very well at making money and try to be socially responsible. So we have to pay much more attention to it. And then in the EU specific question that was asked, which I think great. So the EU looked like a really positive story until fairly recently. And so the question of what happened to that is there. But when it was a positive story, there were already problems. So I am mostly what's called a historical social scientist. That is, I try to explain things that have already happened. And I've only had one time in which I've been very much of a predictive social scientist, and it was here in Barcelona. When I happened to land in Barcelona the day of the referendum on the new basic law in Europe, and was interviewed within an hour or something of landing, and jet lagged and tired, I moved into prediction. I said, it's going to fail. There is not going to be ratification in enough countries to have the new basic law for Europe, because the basic law has been written in a way that appeals to Europeans' elites and not enough of the ordinary people of Europe. It was hundreds of pages long. You had to have a degree from Sciences Po to be able to read it, let alone memorize it or something like that. It didn't feel basic to people. And indeed, it was defeated in a couple of places, and it didn't become the law. And to me, this is a sort of shift, an issue in Europe, when Europe stops being a construction of people who share a common vision and starts being a more bureaucratic, centralized account of what should be the vision, whether it's actually the vision of the people or not. And it's very problematic when the political and administrative leaders try to tell the people what the people should think. And I think that's sort of what happened. Now, I think in Europe, there was always a sense in which there was a so-called Europe of nations vision that was mostly subordinated to a stronger and stronger centralization. And what we have with the right-wing version now is often a kind of Europe of nations vision that says we all need our particularity, we need our national traditions. We're going to return to that, together with a lot of very right-wing and sometimes violent and racist understandings that don't have to go with that Europe of the nations, but have been now bundled into it. And so trying to rethink that and get out of that is important to a political construction. And the last thing I'll say about it is it needs to be political in a broad sense that includes a wide range of citizens talking to each other, not a narrow sense of only politicians talking to each other.
Més, allà darrere hi ha l'Elisenda, i si no n'hi ha més, un altre i un altre, perfecte. M'estaves demanant, Marta?
Sí.
No? Fem l'Elisenda i dos aquí.
Thank you. It was a very nice lecture. I wanted to ask you about your view on what do you think it's going to be the view of Donald Trump on stateless nationalism, and this type of national conflicts, because his first comment about Greenland made us think, okay, this is the traditional imperialist view, but on the other hand, the US tradition of this type of right-wing populism is more like autarkic rather than interventionist in world affairs. And another possibility, it might be that he would be helping national minorities in Iran or China just because that serves his interest on the conflict with China, but don't be at all respecting self-determination as a principle in general.
Aquí hi havia un... Mira, serà més pràctic començar per la banda i després anirem al...
Good evening. So as a young person right now studying economics, well, do you believe that on the near future, the definition of nation will broaden with younger people migrating from one country to the other? Or do you think this will polarize more the population and maybe keep us humans at the same position as we are right now? Thank you very much.
Okay, great questions. A third?
Another one.
Yeah.
Then we...
Yeah.
Good evening, thank you. Left-wing nationalism focused on progressivism and human rights is often at odds with geopolitics and the factual need of states to assert their interests, economic and political and such. How can you craft a rhetoric that highlights progressive/liberal ideals through nationalism without coming across as hypocritical when you, as a government, indeed have to assert your national interests in a global stage? Thank you.
Okay, another great question. Answer it now? Okay, 3, in order, and trying to do better on being brief. I'm sort of afraid you answered the question. I'm afraid because I don't like the answer, but I think it's the true answer, which is that the dominant response of the Trump administration, not necessarily of all Americans, but of the Trump administration, will be biased by what they see as the US national interests in every case. So they will not develop anything like a general policy for stateless people. They will look at every question of minority or stateless peoples in terms of how does the US win or lose. And that will be the base of evaluation, not only in relation to China, but just in general, economically and so forth. And so sometimes they will, in fact, support a minority or stateless people because they think it is in the US interest. Much more often, they will not, and in line with that autarkic American tradition and with Trump's earlier statements, they will not be interventionist abroad very often. So the US will be militaristic often, I think, in seizing territory it can add to the US or expanding its sphere of influence, not unlike Russia, right? But it will not be trying to intervene in conflicts where there is not a clear American interest, only a human interest of some kind. The question about broadening the nation is, I think, an interesting one in which you rightly ask the question, and you frame it as, with young people or the environmental movement, can we broaden the interest of nation? There are various ways to broaden the definition of nation. And I think we need to take that seriously without assuming that broader or narrower is consistently the right answer. So for example, conquest is broadening nation, right? Let's get bigger nations. Maybe the whole world only needs to have 10 of them, right? We've gone through a very long period of introducing more new nations with the divisions off from existing countries. And I think that there's going to be pressure against that. And so I'm not especially optimistic about it, and it relates to the previous question, because there are cases, the case of Palestine is to me a very compelling example of a stateless people that have been put in a worse situation by the larger world community, as well as by their neighbor Israel, and the need for action of a different kind is compelling, but I'm not optimistic at all that this will come in the short run. It may come eventually. What I think more optimistically, since I'm in favor of hope as well as anxiety, will come is more sense of both and solutions. That is, I think that there's a problem with trying to solve all the issues of nationality, of unrepresented people or stateless nations by sovereignty, right? Will there be a sovereign Roma people at the edges of Hungary and Romania? I don't think so. Right? But I think that there might be pressure for better treatment and local autonomy for Roma populations in each country, right? And so that finding ways to have overlapping sovereignty or both and makes sense in that way. And it also makes sense if you think of the environmental or climate issues. I think it's not a question of bigger or smaller nation states or of universalism. It's often a question of can the people who share a river, right, work out cooperative relations with each other, which can be hard even within a country. We see that in India and some places, but especially when there are different countries involved. And can we recognize regional authorities for some purposes? So that instead of an idea of sovereignty that says it's either all or nothing, you either have complete control of everything or you have no political control, there is some level of shared control for certain purposes. Complicated, but I think more hope there, at least some hope there. And then last question in this, I'm asked about the issue of I'm going to put it in my term, idealized version of the left, right? So that when the left says we are all about human rights and ignores the extent to which, say, global capitalism produces human rights challenges, and we are all about progress and ignores the extent to which, hey, our wonderful new technologies depend on minerals being extracted on the lands of indigenous peoples by forced labor, right? We are hypocritical. And in many ways, I think I said a soft version of this answer. I'll say it more hardly. I said it in relation to the previous question about global coalitions, that people who, when pushed, feel bad about coerced labor and bad about extraction and bad about these problems, don't feel that way very many hours of our day. We feel bad for 20 minutes while reading the newspaper, and then we go about our business and we buy the products in the way we bought them before. If we are Americans, we order them all the time from Amazon and they come in plastic containers, and then we recycle our newspapers. But we don't change the production and shipping system. And but in versions of that all over, I think that this is the real problem. So it's partly the hypocrisy of the broad left liberal view, which is why I think the people in the political classes of most countries contributed to the coming of this right-wing populist, more conflictual nationalism, because they didn't solve any of these problems, so they're being hypocritical. It's partly specifically about capitalism. Can you confront these problems without confronting capitalism, either in general or in specific forms of capitalism? But it's not only about that. It's also about, say, the way we think about demographic questions and countries with young populations, countries with aging populations. So not being able to find a way over the last 50 years to get Europeans to think coherently about what it means to have declining birth rates and still need nurses to take care of old people in hospitals. And I would say there is no European country that has thought about that coherently, and the EU as a whole hasn't thought about that coherently. The US has its particular versions. It hasn't been quite as bad on that issue, but it has its own versions, and the new US government's very bad on that issue, in which we aren't even, it's not just that we're hypocritical, it's that we aren't even able to take a fairly long-term view of our own selfish interests.
Tancament, última ronda, hi havia la mà de l'Eunice i jo mateix faré una última pregunta. So, last round.
This is not going to be my question, but Umut Oskrimli, he wrote that online, so he's following us. And he asks, what role would left populism play in resisting to right-wing post-liberalism?
Okay, it's a reasonable question.
Sorry, let me add a question to this, because I think I have a last question.
The question is, in essence, what role did left-wing populism, which I think must mean Yanis Varoufakis and the Indignados and so forth of the era of the financial crisis, play in resisting right-wing nationalism? And my answer is not a lot in the long run. Could it play more? Could the left have done a better job of building on movements like the Indignados or something? Yes, much more. And I think that it ends up being a moment, a period of a couple of years when there were these mobilizations, rather than being a continuous building. There were things that could have been a part of building a better future that weren't developed as much out of that time and the response to the financial shock. And I think populism doesn't need to be a dirty word. I think, and we use, you said it, and I'm going to echo you, Emma, in saying, we say left and right for convenience, but it's kind of like there's always a footnote that says, we're using left and right for convenience, but we don't think there is an essential, definite meaning of this. It's complicated, it's historical, it's different in different countries. We have to say that to ourselves, because I think the world doesn't shake out neatly in left and right. But there are, what's important in the question that was asked by, I think, Umut Oskrimli, was that we recognize that populism comes with different politics, and that I won't go into a longer account of what populism is, but this kind of politics that is about mobilizing people who have not been so politically active before, can be in the service of left or right-wing ideologists. And what I think happened to a large extent is the left was too worried about being dignified and having seats in the legislature to spend much time worrying about the indignados, the people who were undignified because they were put in that position by the economy.
Just make a last question as a summary. One thing that it was very interesting from your presentation was the fight against simplism. If we look at the world in a simplistic way, we very much understand that there is a perception from certain left movements saying, if you have to be a progressive leader in a globalized world, you have to somehow escape the national idea. So you have to move away from the concept of nation because it's something contradictory. From the other perspective, there is, on the other extreme, if you want to call it, there is a perception that if you talk about nation, that means that you are a right-wing thinker. So in between those two extremes, my question is, can it be possible, or how is possible to build a progressive leadership with a globalized perspective and with a nation feeling that is not scared about nation, but is concerned about the global issues? And just to add, is the civic republicanism maybe a possible container that can help us to build this kind of global new leadership or renew leadership?
So, great question, maybe two or three. But I'm sure everybody is willing to stay until midnight, so I'm going to answer all of them in detail. Quickly, the first part of what you said is exactly right. It seems to me that our misunderstandings of nationalism, by saying it's all on this side, right? That if you are serious about international questions, you can't possibly take your nation seriously, right? That's bad. It's not just wrong, right? But it creates problems. Similarly, if you think whenever people talk about nationalism, they are talking about the worst kind of right-wing populism or even fascism, that's wrong, but it also makes it harder for us to do our work and solve our collective problems. Now, for the second part of your question, what I would say about what can we do going forward, the easy sort of response is, of course, we need both, but that's too easy to say. So I say, I think that the mechanism that works most, and I'm going to say this in a way, I'm going to anchor my hopes in Catalonia and Barcelona here, all right? Something that I think is true about Catalonia and Barcelona that is not always remembered because people will talk about nationalism as though it's only language politics or it's only one thing or the other, is that all the way through the modern resurgence of Catalan nationalism, whether you date it from the Republic and the Civil War or you date it from the 1970s forward. Either way, right, all the way through, Catalan nationalism has been concerned about building a better life for people in Catalonia. And I think that's the answer. If you are thinking really about solidarity and building better institutions and creating the way in which people can live together, then you cannot take either of those extreme sides on the international. And so people are drawn. It is the question of focusing on society, protecting, achieving, making a better society for people that connects the notion of nation to a progressive internationalism, right? And to avoiding the fascist version of that. If you are really working on making a better society, you can't ignore climate change. Then you say, okay, that's an issue we can't solve by ourselves, but we can be a part of the global movement to do better on climate change. You are thinking about migration. You say, okay, we need to have better policies about migration inside, and we need to cooperate with other countries externally to be building a better migration regime in the world. And the same thing for public health and so forth. So if politics is really serious about solidarity and more or less equality and better working relations and opportunities in the country, then it becomes necessary to confront problems that have an international dimension and a domestic dimension. And that's the best I can offer.
It's an excellent summary for the conference. So thank you very much. Moltes gràcies a vosaltres per ser aquí. Thank you very much, Craig, for your intervention. I en tot cas, us convidem a que pugueu consultar, òbviament.
Are they always that nice?
Always. I que pugueu consultar, sabeu que això quedarà penjat i per tant podeu consultar, no només consultar-la sinó també difondre-la, perquè crec que el que s'ha dit avui és important que pugui compartir-se. Moltíssimes gràcies i bona nit.
Thank you.